Hi, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's virtual Humber lecture, Women in Art at the NCMA. My name is Maria Lopez, and I am the manager of film and lecture programs at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special lecture that's part of the NCMA's Women's History Month virtual programming. This virtual lecture is supported by the Robert Lee Humber Lecture Endowment. Robert Lee Humber's devotion to the arts, so eloquently and passionately voiced, brought into being the North Carolina Museum of Art. Dr. Humber continued to support the museum through his leadership and acquiring of many important gifts of art until his death in 1970. With pleasure and gratitude, the museum honors Dr. Humber's efforts by establishing annual lectures that provide an opportunity for the public to be inspired by the collection that Dr. Humber made possible. Now, before we begin with the lecture, I'd like to give everyone an overview of the agenda for today. Our lecturer will present for about an hour, and then we will have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session where we will share your questions with our lecturer. Please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A function or the chat box throughout the lecture. We would also like to let everyone know that the lecture will be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube page. And we will also be sharing the recording with you via email. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the NCMA's Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, Jennifer Dassell. Jennifer received her BA in Art History from the University of California, Davis, and her MA in Art History from the University of Notre Dame. And she has completed PhD coursework in Art History at the Pennsylvania State University. Prior to joining the NCMA in 2008, she was a curatorial assistant to the curator of Western art at the Snipe Museum, University of Notre Dame, in Notre Dame, Indiana, and at the Richard L. Nelson Art Gallery, University of California, Davis. She lives in Wendell, North Carolina with her husband, son, and a very grouchy cat. In 2016, Dassell created and continues to host the Art Curious podcast, which is one of my favorites. It's an internationally popular bi-weekly show exposing the unexpected, the slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. It was chosen as one of PC Magazine's best podcasts of the year for 3 years in a row, 2018 to 2020, and it was selected as one of the best history podcasts of 2019 by the Oprah magazine. In September 2020, Dassell's first book, Art Curious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History, was released by Penguin Books. The book has already received a much coveted starred review from Publishers Weekly and highlighted in Book Page, Book List, and other publications. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I want to thank everybody for being here with me tonight to talk about women in art, which is one of my very favorite subjects of all time to discuss. So I'm very appreciative to have you here to join me tonight. And I am going to be taking you through a tour of art history to discover the position first of women throughout art and time, beginning with a discussion of the rise of women artists as artistic creators, and then showcasing some of my favorite works from women in the NCMA collection from the 19th century onwards. So again, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Let's begin by talking about what we see on the screen, which is Leonardo da Vinci's iconic Mona Lisa. How about Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus? Or Edward Manet's Olympia, or even Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror. So what do these things all have in common? I think it's probably as easy as you think it is, which is that these are 4 fantastically iconic works in the history of art. And their subjects are, of course, women, or girls in the case of Picasso, that he calls it Girl Before a Mirror. Now, what else do they have in common, though? So not only do they have representations of women, but they were also each painted by men. As we know, the history of art really stretches back thousands upon thousands of years, from the earliest cave paintings found in France and Spain, Sulawesi and Borneo, which each date to approximately 50,000 to 20,000 years BCE, all the way up to the minute digital creations of today's contemporary artists. Many things, of course, have really drastically changed in those thousands of years, but one of the largest changes has been defining the position of women in the arts. And traditionally, when we consider works of art around the world and we think about women's place in it, our first instinct is to consider works of art of such as the four that I'm showing you on the screen here, because we usually think of them as subjects more than creators, just on instinct. And what is the most common female subject matter representation of all time? It's first and foremost the nude. So on the screen, I'm showing you one of the earliest figurative sculptures representing a woman. And this is a piece known as the Venus of Villendorf, which dates from approximately 25 to 21,000 years BCE. So such a creation like this, which may or may not have had some kind of religious significance, people don't totally know for sure, really represents the manner in which women were visualized for a great long while in art history, which is here we see an anonymous woman whose biological features, mainly her reproductive features, are greatly exaggerated. And her curviness is amplified to suggest this optimal sensation of nourishment and possibly even pregnancy. So with such a visual focus, the Venus of Villendorf really becomes a predominant symbol of health and fertility, or a totem which addresses the strength and the survival instincts of the clan, which potentially produced this work of art. So the earliest representation of women, and really indeed all humans at this point in art history, were more symbolic than specific. So please allow me a little bit of a digression, but it does allow me to talk about one work in our collection to start, which is this one that you see on the screen in detail, which is model of a boat that dates from Egypt's Middle Kingdom dynasty, which is approximately about 1985 to 1650 BCE. The crew that we have manning the vessel here, they're not specific people. They're not people who can be identified by name. And instead, we can just see them as generalities. So it's not like we're looking at Bob and Joe and their buddies navigating the Nile, but they're obviously simply understood as workers who are performing activities from daily life. But we have to think about who naturally would probably be the person who is asking for these works of art to be created. Who would be able to afford such lavish and powerful things as an aesthetic representation of oneself? So first thing we can think about, obviously, is royalty, of course, or other individuals of high import throughout history. And that really makes perfect sense. So on the screen, we have an example. This is a sculpture of the Egyptian king Menkaure and his wife, Queen Cameretnabi. I think I got that right, apologies. And this dates from about 2515 BCE, and it was found in Giza. And the queen and the king, we can see them that they're standing side by side in a traditional pose that signifies their marital status. And not only are both figures carved from this amazing single block of stone, but the queen embraces her husband to suggest their relationship. And as you can see, the queen is also dressed across in this very tightly fitted garment across her body that really reveal, again, those womanly curves. She isn't exaggerated to the same degree as the Venus of Villendorf, naturally, but her power and her status as queen is, though very extraordinary, is still secondary to her symbolic nature. Her curves continue to suggest the importance of fertility and what that means to continuing a dynastic line, while at the same time acting as this visual representation of feminine beauty and grace. So these traditions of women representing beauty, purity, grace, and fertility would really continue throughout the centuries and would establish many of the dominant reasons for women to be represented in art. Power would always be a loophole in this equation, so that powerful women, regardless of their beauty or their marital status, would nevertheless be painted or sculpted. So for example, Queen Elizabeth is one of the great examples of an unmarried but very powerful woman who had countless works of art done in her honor. But creating a work of art for a woman for the sake of creation, In such a work of art, for the longest time, women were really just meant to represent ideals. So we have the allure and the beauty of Venus or Aphrodite, something from ancient literature or even religion, or the nurturing abundance of motherhood, the piety and the fidelity of a Christian wife, for example. And of course, I'm speaking mainly from the Western art perspective today, just making that part clear. Or it could be the sensual pleasures of unchecked passions or the guilt of a fallen woman. So women were thought to be the muses, the inspiration for all of these symbolic gestures, but were never really for the longest time thought of as being an artist or the artist themselves who could actually do the work of creating these works. Now, what to make about this image, which is again from our own permanent collection? Because here we see this well-dressed woman who is gesturing with a paintbrush to a floral still life canvas on an easel. This is Michiel van Muscher's allegorical portrait of an artist in her studio. And though, from what we know, it may be plausible that this painting showcases a real life person, and there is thought that maybe this represents a Dutch painter named Maria van Osterweich, you'll notice that the title reads very clearly that this is an allegory of an artist, because this painting is similar to many other numerous allegorical subjects that Van Muscher had created throughout his career. And by the time the 17th century, when he was active, rolled around, there had already been established with this long tradition of such allegorical images of painting. The most famous is this print that you see on the screen here called La Pintura, or painting, as imagined by the Italian printmaker and aesthetics guru, a man named Cesare Ripa, in his book that was very popular during the Renaissance and the Baroque periods called Iconologia. And the Iconologia was this highly influential emblem book that was based on Greco-Roman and ancient Egyptian emblematical representations. And this was a very popular book that was used by artists, by poets and orators to give kind of a visual substance to qualities like virtues or vices or passions, to the arts and the sciences. So for each emblem, Ripa then provides this verbal description of the allegorical figure that was thought to really best embody the particular concept that was being represented. So it was usually a person or figure that was being adorned with various paraphernalia that was said to represent the best of that kind of vice or that virtue or that attribute. And in Ripa's description of La Pintura, he writes, quote, "The personification of painting is a very beautiful woman dressed in multicolored garments. She has rich curled hair and is decorated with jewels. On a chain around her neck hangs a medallion of a mask. She is often accompanied by a puto or putti, which trumpet the victory of the arts," end quote. So there is much more to this description than what I'm reading to you tonight, but we can imagine that the similarities between La Pintura and the woman who is potentially the subject of Van Muscher's paintings. And yet, it might very well be that Muscher's painting is and is not a portrait, because it could very well be that the woman is still mainly a symbol here and not necessarily acknowledged as the creator of the work of art, an element of creation, of inspiration, but not necessarily a statement that this as an artist. All that being said, there's a lot of backpedaling that can sometimes be said when it comes to representations of women throughout time. The simple fact that we might be able to point to the sitter as a particular Dutch painter does indicate that a woman really did exist. And in reality, women have been active as artists since literally forever almost. And there's these recent scientific analyses that have been done in the past few years that have posited that the majority of prehistoric cave painters, so really the world's first known artists, were predominantly women and not men. So for example, in 2013, there was a group of archaeologists from Penn State University who released a report that concluded that approximately 75% of cave art was created by women. And they came at this at a very interesting angle. They said that by studying the length of fingers in these extant handprints that you can see on the screen that were found in caves, particularly throughout France and Spain, and they were able to look at how the finger lengths were relative to one another on a handprint. So here's a little bit of an anatomical deep dive. It's not necessarily true across the board, but it is said that typically women tend to have ring fingers and index fingers of about the same length, whereas men's ring fingers tend to be longer than their index fingers. So everybody can kind of take a look and check for themselves if you want for a moment. So while they were examining these ancient handprints then, it was determined that women were really the artistically driven of the caveman set. So as active and actively acknowledged creators though, things really began to improve for women artists beginning in the Middle Ages. Two women in particular, which is Harriet of Landsberg is one of her names, and then on the right is Hildegard of Bingham. Both of them were Catholic nuns who purportedly created these very detailed, illuminated manuscripts that were illustrations of Christian texts and concepts, as well as their own personal religious beliefs that each of them had held. So on the left is a page from Harriet's Hortus Deliciarum, which was this massive folio, whose creation she supervised and to which she contributed not only as an artist, but also in a literary fashion. And the final text of this piece was actually completed in 1195. And then on the right, you have a page from Hildegard's visionary book of knowledge, which is known as the Civias. And that one was begun in 1142 and completed about 10 years later. Now, what you're seeing on the screen of Hildegard's work is extremely interesting because she was a mystic who experienced spiritual visions beginning at a very early age. And she really essentially documented them here in the Civias, which is that you see the image of her receiving this vision in the form of a flame that's coming down. And what's very interesting is that both of these images are actually technically self-portraits. So neither of these women really identified themselves as being artists by profession, but rather their artistic creations were really a mere side effect of their own religious calling, and perhaps was one of the multiple duties that was required of each, as it is widely known that many illuminated manuscripts and Bible translations that were completed during the Middle Ages were indeed created by monks and by nuns. But it wasn't until the height of the Italian Renaissance, just about 400 years later, that we really start to see women popping up in the history of art, proclaiming their own talents and identifying themselves as artists for real for one of the first time. So now it's critical that we stop just for a moment before moving on so that we can consider the various reasons that this made the Renaissance so important, why the Renaissance was so important for all artists, not just women, but also as well as understanding the specifics that allowed women to pursue the arts in a way that was not really feasible before. So I think a few different aspects can really be identified here. Point one is that the humanist atmosphere that infused the Renaissance, especially in Italy and also to a smaller degree in Flanders and England, really influenced this move towards secularism, in art, which culminated in this interest in the representation of the individual, or if not totally devoid from this religious aspect or link, perhaps a more individualistic look at a religious subject. So for example, I have placed Michelangelo's iconic David on the screen here as an example. So point number two, which I think is just as important as point number one, is that art, which in many cases had been created under the jurisdiction of the guild system in many parts of Europe, really began to be seen as created by individuals. And those individuals, for one of the first times, really wanted their names to be known. So it will be of no surprise to us that when we note that in the early Renaissance, just as the Middle Ages were winding up, that it was at this point that European artists, for example, began to actively sign their works of art. So this image, for example, is a really famous self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer, who was created created this one in particular in the year 1500. And you have to really kind of zoom in a little bit to see it on the screen here. But flanking both sides of Dürer's head are these inscriptions that identify himself as an artist twice. So the first is on the left side here, which is his monogram. And then the date of 1500 is noted right above that. And then on the side, the right side of his head, there is an inscription which reads in translation, quote, "I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, portrayed myself in everlasting colors, aged 28 years," unquote. So this inscription is obviously meant for us to admire the artist as an individual, and then to also note his relative youth, which leads us to comment on his prodigious talent and the skill that was received at such a remarkable young age. And so that idea of talent and skill, I think, really leads us to the next point, point 3, which is that the emphasis at this point became on such attributes of talent and skill as being gifts from God, and therefore should be promoted and really celebrated as such. Lastly, a fourth point that I think is closely aligned with point 2 that I mentioned earlier, and that was that from the classical Greco-Roman period in art, so about up to 400 CE, let's say, and through the Middle Ages and up to the very beginning of the Renaissance, art was fairly closely entangled with craft. And by craft, I mean the creation of something that is primarily functional. It has aesthetic qualities, but those aesthetic qualities can sometimes be seen as being secondary. So with the Renaissance, though, we find that there becomes this return to the creation of art for art's sake, without necessarily having a greater purpose than to be art. Patrons, of course, as we talked about earlier, were usually the wealthy, and at this point they were really requesting paintings of themselves or their family members, or they simply wanted, for one of the first times since antiquity, to really be able to adorn their gardens with decorative sculpture, for example. So here, art became a necessary and important element simply because it is art. So therefore, I think all of these different points, these different elements that I've been bringing up to you, can be used to account for the rise in individual artists and the willing to train more people, including women in some very special households, as artists themselves. So I note that women were trained as art makers typically in their own special households. And I think that this is really important to keep in mind as we move forward, because at this time, women were not traditionally admitted to apprenticeships or artist guilds or even formal academies. And that even included inclusion into the famed art schools that were especially found in England and France and Italy at that time. And women would not be allowed entry into these schools until the second half of the 18th century at the earliest. So really, the crop of Renaissance artists, the women Renaissance artists that the Renaissance itself fostered, really is due in most cases to the influence of their families and their circumstances. So most of these women, many of the women that we do know and recognize as Renaissance women artists, were either raised by fathers who were professional or amateur artists themselves, and many of them became painters simply because their fathers were painters. And additionally, those who were lucky enough to be born into a wealthy or an aristocratic family may have also been affected by the spread of Renaissance ideas that was also all in a flutter about the education of women, which also include the education of women in the fine arts. So as another brief aside, as we move closer to our collection, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite Renaissance artists who is on the screen here, Sophia Anguisola. She was born circa 1530, 1532 in Lombardy, and she was one of 7 children, 6 of whom were girls. And she was, of course, raised in a very noble and affluent home. And her father encouraged all of his children, not just his one son, but all of his daughters as well, to cultivate all kinds of artistic talents. And 4 of Sofianesba's sisters, not just Sofianesba herself, but 4 other ones, became painters. But Sofianesba was by far the most accomplished and renowned. And her father supported her education by allowing her to be apprenticed in the studio of several painters. And so at her age of just being in her teens, she had a total of about 3 years of professional artistic training, which was really quite an achievement for women at this time. But yet, of course, it does not compare to the caliber of professional training that was received by most of her male counterparts, each of whom would have probably had an absolute minimum of 4 years as an apprentice before being able to go on to further studies or to pursue a career as an artist. Nevertheless, the large amount of self-portraits that were created by Anguisola, only some of which I'm showing you on the screen here, really suggest that she was very aware of her unique position and that she was consistently representing herself at the canvas especially. And you can see her in multiple times showing off her writing skills, her musical skills, as you can see, and also her image of her as a painter, where she would frequently show herself with the traditional implements of her crafts like palettes and mahl sticks and brushes. In this work, which I think is really cool, it's called Bernardo Campy Painting Sofianesba Anguisola, which dates to the late 1550s. This is not a painting by Bernardo Campy, it's by Sophia Anguisola showing one of her teachers painting a portrait of her. So again, we see that Anguisola was not only very aware of her image as an exemplar of female artistic achievement, but she also understood the importance of the lineage between pupil and master and her unique role as a producer of images of women, especially images of herself. So here we see her painting again as if she's being painted by her teacher. And so it creates this really fascinating dual portrait. And of course, one that is extra intriguing because it not only asserts the traditional role of woman as muse or simple object of representation, but also notes her importance as being the creator behind the canvas, while simultaneously confirming both traits for her teacher as well. And for her, by the way, it totally paid off, because she apparently traveled to Rome when she was very young with her father. And then it said that she was introduced to none other than Michelangelo himself, who, from all the surviving accounts, was quite impressed with Sofianesba Anguisola's skills. And she would later go on to become one of the official painters for the Spanish court of Philip II. And she became so lauded and celebrated that at the end of her life, Anthony van Dyck, who created this simply gorgeous piece in our collection, the portrait of Lady Mary Villiers, paid a visit to Sofianesba Anguisola when she was 92 years old to really ask her questions about her work and her career, and to basically sit at the foot of the master, or mistress in this case. So here is that portrait of her that he eventually would paint based on the sketches that he did of her during his visit. This explosion of the arts and arts education and humanist thinking during the Renaissance really allowed women like Sofianesba Anguisola to pursue these non-traditional artistic paths in the visual arts, and thus allowed many other women to follow suit. So though popular and respected in their own times, though, it's obviously not a surprise to many of us that they would later be in great droves be forgotten or dismissed, only to be reconsidered or rediscovered in the 20th century. I'm thinking in particular about artists like the incredible Artemisia Gentileschi, Judith Leister, and also Elizabeth Vijay Lebrun. And something I want to point out about these 3 women that I've just shown you is that I want you to notice how very clearly and very carefully they all were to create these detailed self-portraits. The latter 2, so Vijay Lebrun on the screen here, and then Judith Leister, who you just saw, would at various points fall victim to these negative appraisals of their work based on their gender in such a way that it was said that their art was considered too accomplished to have been created by women. Therefore, many of Leister's canvases would for many years be falsely attributed to her contemporary, Franz Hals, whereas a number of the works by Elizabeth Vijay Lebrun were just as suddenly credited frequently, and all too frequently, even into the 20th century, as being by the neoclassicist Jacques-Louis David. And here I am finally allowing us to look at our first work in the NCMA collection by an identifiable woman artist. And as I've noted before, there are many works that in our collection may very well have been made by women or completed by women in any way, but we are simply unable to verify the creator. I'm particularly thinking about works in our ancient art collections, both ancient American and also ancient Greco-Roman works, Egyptian, and of course our African collection as well. This work is by none other than Vijay Lebrun herself, who is and has always been one of my absolute favorite artists. She was one of the top French painters of the 18th century and is most definitely one of the best known and most important women artists of all time. She rose to prominence during the years before the French Revolution, and she became famous throughout Europe when she became the official court painter to none other than Marie Antoinette herself. And I often like to point to the revolutionary nature of this in and of itself, because the top painter to the top woman in France was a woman herself. And at the late 18th century, that was still revolutionary because Marie Antoinette could have chosen anyone. And instead, she chose to have herself represented by another young woman, which was truly phenomenal. But in 1789, with the dawning of the French Revolution, obviously, things took a turn for the worse for many people who were aligned with the royalty and the monarchy, the French monarchy. So Elizabeth Vijay Lebrun escaped Paris because of that association with the Queen. Quite literally meant that her life was going to be on the line. But she did not stop painting, nor did she stop meeting this intense level of success throughout her life. In 1790, she was elected to become a member of the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, which was one of the most important art associations of that era. And she also worked to paint the nobility and royal families of many different European cities and nations, including but not limited to Florence, Naples, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Berlin, all before finally, closer to the end of her life, returning to France. And we are very lucky to have one of those amazing noble portraits from the time in which she was a little bit peripatetic. This one is what we have. It's our Count Ivan Ivanovich Shuvalov, excuse me, I always want to say Schumaloff, from about 1797 to the early part of the 1800s. So Shuvalov wasn't a big name, or isn't a big name to many of us during these days, but he was, from all accounts, kind of a biggie back in Elizabeth Vijay Lebrun's days, which in fact is because he was the lover of the Empress Elizabeth II of Russia. And he was very popular. He was known as an intellectual with a great love for the arts in particular, and he spent his life really promoting the development of the arts throughout Russia during the most formative 18th century in Russia. And one of the great things about Vijay Lebrun is that not only was she an amazing artist, but she wrote her memoirs before her death at age of 86 in 1842. And in her memoirs, she was able to talk about all of the different people who sat for her. And she discusses Shuvalov very briefly. And this is what she writes about him. She says, quote, "He combined courteous manners with obliging politeness, and he was a fine man, and he was sought out by the best of society," unquote. And so I like to think that that idea of politeness and nobility, as well as the warmth that was obviously there, really comes through in this beautiful sympathetic portrait. There seems to be this little slight upturn of his mouth as if he's about to break into a smile. And there is really this lovely twinkle to his very lively eyes, which I think makes this portrait a little more gentle in some ways, and also a little bit sadder because we know that Shuvalov actually died in 1797, which is when most scholars believe that this painting was actually begun. So it is probable that this is the posthumous creation. But again, like, what a wonderful one it is. And Vijay Lebrun was always so skilled at making someone look even more engaging and delightful and beautiful than they were in real life. And she was very famous, both before in her own lifetime and obviously long after, as being someone who had the incredible skills of flattery, which is also just one of the reasons why she was so popular throughout her lifetime as well. As I mentioned previously, she fell out of the limelight over time, and her work was often attributed to other artists like Jacques-Louis David. But thankfully, many of her works have been rediscovered, as it were, and have been happily reappraised and super celebrated. I'm thinking in particular of a major exhibition that was dedicated to her in 2016 that was organized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Grand Palais in Paris, and the National Gallery in Canada in Ottawa, and it traveled all over the world. So she really has returned in the 20th century to being one of the biggest artists. Now, while I move on from Vijay Lebrun, I want to talk a little bit about a critical change that occurred in the late 18th century that began to allow women to be admitted into art academies throughout Europe. So I talked about how Elizabeth Vijay Lebrun was allowed into the San Luca Academy in Rome. That started happening again for more and more women at this point. But of course, it couldn't be all that easy because though many women could now be admitted to some of the same classes, some as their male counterparts, and though they could start participating as artists in salon events and exhibitions, there was nevertheless the trouble of the nude. So the image that you're seeing on the screen here is a work by Johann Zoffani, a Swiss painter, entitled The Academicians of the Royal Academy, and it dates from 1771. And as the title notes, it represents the members of the British Royal Academy, which had been instituted in 1768. And so Zoffani is showing us the artists in all of their bewigged finery as if they've just been interrupted in the middle of a nude study class. As you can see, there's a male nude there on the right side of the image. And strangely enough, our academicians seem to be lacking in most cases here anything that they might be needing to work on this nude study. So there's no canvases or any paper around. So it's kind of a curious one. But what do we see included here on the far right wall hanging above the the men's heads? These two portraits. So these are the portraits of the only two women who were admitted into the very first class of the British Royal Academy, which is Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser. So Zoffani has included portraits of them here, just hanging on the wall, because it was really deemed unladylike and unseemly for women artists to be included in these anatomy and life drawing classes, because nude study forever has been considered one of the centerpieces of academic artistic training. And as a result of this prohibition, the professional education of women artists for a long time was really considered woefully incomplete. And many women really suffered from an inadequate understanding of anatomy, which hindered not only their portraits, but also incredible gains in history painting and large commissions that they hoped to receive. Women were able to see the occasional female nude, which was deemed slightly less offensive to their delicate sensibilities. But many life study classes really contained models who were most modestly draped. So, for example, the work here on the screen is called In the Studio by a Franco-Russian artist named Marie Baskersef. And it was completed almost about 100 years later after the Zoffani. And it reflects the ladies of a Parisian academy called the Académie Julienne, who are hard work here at their life class. And they're painting this young boy who's attired in some kind of classical mode. And it thus may come as not much of a surprise when we note that the squabbles over the appropriateness of life drawing classes for women created such distress within the British Academy, for example, that no woman was actually allowed membership after Kauffman and Moser were until 1922. So it caused such an uproar that they basically said, okay, we're just going to wash our hands of this and not let women in at all. As the 19th century progressed, thankfully, there were more opportunities for women artists to really step into the limelight, and many of them stayed there, which is incredible. So their works were not forgotten or undervalued to the same degree that their predecessors were. So I'm thinking predominantly of Morisot here and Mary Cassatt on the left and right, respectively, who are just a couple examples of artists who are still considered to be major heavyweights when we think about the Impressionist movement, for example. And their works and their lives as women artists are still hugely valued today. So I think it was such a coup that we relatively recently were able to add none other than a work by Mary Cassatt herself to the collection. And here it is. This is the portrait of Madame X dressed for the matinee, and it's dated from 1877 to 1878. Now, I wrote about this last week in our NCMA recommends email because I have to say, before we move on, that the title sometimes does make things a little bit more difficult for us today than perhaps it should be, because I often hear folks wondering or even just proclaiming straight up that this is the same Madame X as in the famous or rather infamous portrait by John Singer Sargent on the right side. Not the same person. We 100% know who Madame X, the singer Madame X, is, but we don't for sure know the identity of the sitter in the Mary Cassatt. What we do know is that Mary Cassatt's first biographer called this woman a, quote, sister-in-law of a friend of the artist, unquote. So, you know, friend of a friend. It's not a lot to go on, but it's enough that some scholars have posited a few potential identifications of who this woman could be. But for most of us, she is still Madame X for now, because simply that's how one of the first artist biographies described this work in a 1970 catalog raisonné of Mary Cassatt's works. So really, I think the actual identification of our Madame X here doesn't totally matter, because what is important either way is that this woman is a total, complete Cassatt sitter, basically the epitome of the kind of woman that Mary Cassatt would paint. So someone who is probably wealthy, a little bit independent, and very stylish. So we can see that she's all bound up in this beautiful high-necked black dress and this very posh hat. And she's holding this pair of opera glasses in her clasped hands. And what's fascinating to me about this work is that the dress itself actually helps us to identify her as someone who is attending a matinee performance of the theater or the opera, simply because what she is wearing is an elegant dress, but is not a formal one or a flashy one, more au courant for an affair, which you'd traditionally have women at. And what you also see here is a woman who's seated by herself. We don't see another man or anybody there who is accompanying them. So attending a matinee would have been an incredibly freeing thing for both the sitter and also Mary Cassatt herself, the artist, to do, because matinee performances were these important places for women to go and feel somewhat independent. Because in Paris in the 1870s, when this work was done, and then certainly also for a while after, the idea of a woman who would be attending an event by herself, unaccompanied by a man, would have really been scandalous, because the idea of a solo woman who is out and about after nightfall especially would have been someone who was coded as a sex worker or another kind of quote unquote fallen woman. But matinees, they were obviously still in the daytime, in the afternoon before the setting of the sun. So these were seen as events that women could attend on their own and without issue, which made it a very comfortable place for Cassatt and Madame X. And so I think you get the sensation of relaxed expectation and even a little bit of casualness that comes across to us in the portrait. So Madame X looks right at us with that little hint of a smile on her face, and her mouth is open just a tiny little bit. So it's almost like she's about to engage us in conversation. And that openness, I think, certainly reflects back on the artist, who you have to imagine is in the same position here. So thinking about an unmarried woman, Mary Cassatt was unmarried, she never married, and she really chafed against the traditional restrictions of women in her day. So you can really imagine that Mary Cassatt and Madame X probably felt this incredible kinship together as they were prepared to enjoy this liberating outing together. And let's also not forget that when this work was acquired by the museum in 2013, it was the first major work by an American artist to be added to the collection the time prior to 1945, which is the date of our Georgia O'Keeffe painting. So that's a really important addition. But thankfully, it is not the last major work by an American artist to be added to the collection prior to O'Keeffe's, because in 2017, we brought this beauty into the collection. This is Daphne by Harriet Hosmer, who was one of the first professional female sculptors of the modern era. And it was certainly considered one of the most distinguished female sculptors, if not the most distinguished female sculptor in the US in the 19th century. So like Edmonia Lewis, who is another artist that I hope desperately that we will have the opportunity to show here, if not maybe miraculously acquire, Hosmer lived this incredible expatriate artistic life in Rome, in this expatriate community. You can see her surrounded there, this little woman in the middle, by all of the men who helped her in her work. And she really became quite renowned in Europe, especially in Europe during her lifetime. So she was truly a very important figure in American art. And we are so blessed, I think, to have this work of art, because this one in particular was Hosmer's first fully professional sculpture. So the first work that she completed as a full-time working artist, no longer a student, not an apprentice. And she also referred to this work very lovingly as, quote, my first child, which I love. The Greek myth of Daphne is where she has taken her inspiration today, as the name suggests. And in case you don't know the backstory of Daphne, I'll give you the brief, which is that Daphne was a naiad, or a water nymph, who was the daughter of a river god, as is recorded by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. And it's said that the god Apollo fell in love with her and just pursued her so ardently without Daphne's consent or mutual interest, it must be added. So I think it's one of those ultimate Me Too stories. So the story goes that Daphne cried out to her father, the river god, to ask for help as she's being pursued by Apollo. And he answers her prayers by transforming her from a woman to a laurel tree. It's a myth that has been long detailed in art history, I think perhaps most famously in sculpture by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the Baroque period in 1622 here. But Hosmer's take is notable on a few different accounts. First, she's opted to remove Apollo from the story entirely. So she shines all the attention on Daphne herself. And then next, she's focusing only on this bust-length portrait of Daphne here, instead of a more ambitious, full body representation, which I think makes very good sense considering that this was Hosmer's first fully professional work. So I think it's really smart of her. And it also allowed her the opportunity to create a very gentle study of a rather idealized, beautiful young woman. But lastly, it also shows Daphne in a different light than many of these traditional representations and renditions. So I want to call your attention back to the Bernini again, because as an Italian Baroque artist like Bernini was wont to be, Baroque artists really wanted to highlight the most dramatic moments in stories. So we see in his work this transformation starting and not finishing yet. And you see Daphne's face with this of fear or surprise, or perhaps both. And for some, it was considered a detractor to Harriet Hosmer's works that she didn't include this incredibly dramatic, formative moment, this expressive moment. So when this work was first shown in Boston in 1854, there was a reviewer in the Boston Telegraph who sniped that Harriet Hosmer had all but removed the drama and the color from the story. But I've got to say, I heartily disagree, because Hosmer instead makes Daphne a willing participant in her own story. So we can see her more as this strong woman who is accepting of her fate. And that really seems to be Hosmer's personal take on the matter, because in describing this artwork, she talked about it as a vision of the nymph with her head down, eyes lowered, being very brave in accepting this transformation instead of, quote, just sinking away into the laurel leaves, unquote. So it really is one of the first times that we really get to understand the myth of Daphne and Apollo just from Daphne's perspective. And it's one where she might not get the happiest ending in the world, as I don't think Daphne is much of a positive or happy figure in this tales from Ovid, but she isn't necessarily a victim here either, which is how she traditionally is represented. And that is rather incredible. And some historians have gone even further to note that this work may have been Hosmer's way of pushing back against conventions and expectations, just like Mary Cassatt did, and that this was even potentially a very veiled feminist work of art, and one that I think really garners even more layers of interest when you consider the fact that Hosmer was a lesbian who chose to remain unmarried at a time when single women were really viewed with a lot of suspicion. She once wrote, I think really beautifully, quote, "I honor every woman who has strength enough to step outside the beaten path when she feels that her walk lies in another, strength enough to stand up and be laughed at if necessary," unquote. I mean, how can you not love that? Okay, we are in the home stretch. Welcome to the 20th century, yay! So it took us a long time to get here, right? But we will be fast forwarding a little bit in time here in a moment, but before we do so, please allow me another digression, because we're about to get into something really fascinating, which is that a lot of things are about to get better, a lot better before women artists. But they might not get quite as better as quickly as you'd expect. So bear with me. Today, we can take for granted the fact that anyone can become an artist, so either as a vocation or an avocation, and that men and women are really able to receive the same amount of training without gender differentiation or separation. And in fact, some of the biggest names in contemporary art today are women. So Tara Donovan, for example, Rachel Whitehead, and Kara Walker, just to name a few select examples. But of course, as we've been discussing tonight, this was not always the case, because women artists were seen as the exception, not the norm, all the way up to the dawn of the 20th century. So it's probably not a surprise to us when we start looking at the makeup of most museum collections that there is a noticeable imbalance, just as there is often a noticeable imbalance between the number of works that were created in Europe or in the European or Western tradition in comparison to those that were created elsewhere, so anywhere in Asia or in Africa, for example. In our modern and contemporary collection here at the NCMA, for instance, we have just about 500 works, just shy of that, 474 at last count. And that includes works by women artists. And I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with many of the works and by these women that we have, like Devorah Sperber, Maud Gatewood, Iona Roselle Brown, Lala Asadi, Carolyn Demerit, Minnie Evans, Beverly McKeever, Daisy Youngblood, and Liddell Moe, just to give you a few of those nearly 500 works of art. So at first glance, almost 500 really seems like a lot. And in actuality, it is an amazing number of works by women, just based on the numbers alone. When we look at the total number of works in our collection, not just in, let me take that back. When we look at the total number of objects in the modern and contemporary collection, which we somewhat loosely consider to be any work around 1900 or 1910, we have just about 2,500 works of art. So when you crush the numbers, works created by women equal about 19% of the collection. And the good news is that that number is consistently growing. What's interesting, though, is that it's probably been about 7 or 8 years since I last did a tally like this. And because of the really vast number of works of art that have entered the collection in this time, our percentage of women works in the collection have actually decreased by about 5 percentage points. So it's not that we're collecting fewer works by women, and in fact, it is quite the opposite, as I'll get to shortly. But because we've been fortunate enough to receive so many acquisitions, both purchases and gifts, and estate bequeathments and so forth, that the proportion of men from those kind of gifts just further overweighs the women at this juncture. So when we compare that percentage, again, this 19% across the NCMA collection as a whole, so all departments, it's a different picture. We can tally just about 7, in some cases, maybe 8 works by women that date from before the dawn of the 20th century. I'm showing you just a couple of works that I'm not going to go into detail on the screen here. So we do have a bronze cast of a work by Berthe Morisot, and of course, this wonderful portrait of Rodin by Camille Claudel. I'm not going to talk about them too much tonight, but just wanted to point those out. So in taking account all of the works by women in our whole collection, that means that roughly 11% of the museum collection is made up of works that are completely identifiable as being created by women. And in reviewing reports of other institutions, it appears that the NCMA is actually fairly standard in this regard. So with the exception of museums like the National Museum of Women in the Arts, whose aims are understandably very specific, museum collections across the board are still very imbalanced. And though it is probably understood, it should also be noted that the same discrepancies apply across the board to many, if not most, US institutions when it comes to racial diversity, religious and sexual diversity as well. And so it's important for all of us to acknowledge these imbalances and to also actively work towards correcting them. Most surprisingly to me is that this imbalance isn't too different in the case of exhibitions, both in museums and in galleries. So I found the 2 slides that I'm going to be showing you next in a book called After the Revolution, Women Who Transformed Contemporary Art. And the author of that book, Eleanor Hartney, noted that since the 1970s feminist movement, art historians have made such a huge headway in identifying women artists and furthering the study of those women, which is hugely positive. But of course, Hartney performed a research study that I think is very revealing, though I do want to keep in mind the fact that this book is a little old now and that it's 8 years outdated as of this point. But the first slide I want to show you is this one, which is one that represents the number and percentages of solo exhibitions by gender at American galleries since the 1970s. And then this one, where Hartney asked the same question about solo exhibitions at museums by gender. And so in both of these slides, you'll note that the darker, more kind of maroon color represents the number of solo shows dedicated to women artists, whereas the lighter purple color represents the same number devoted to male artists. So in both of those charts, exhibitions dedicated to women and women only are still significantly lower than those dedicated to men. And this is going on 50 or so years after the so-called feminist revolution. So women are still being shown in museums about half as much as men are at best. And in many situations, in a solo capacity, remember, they are being represented only about a third as much. So museums and galleries, I do have to say, cannot be solely blamed for the disparity here, because as we've discussed tonight, it has a lot more to do with history than any number of institutions. There has been a lot of blindness throughout time, both innocent and not so innocent, towards the work of women. And this was first brought to light in 1971 in conjunction with the then burgeoning feminist movement, when the late great art historian Linda Nochlin, who you see on the screen here and is a personal hero of mine, published this seminal article called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And she has these wonderful questions where she asks about the so-called woman problem, because she wants to know the difference in quality between the works that are done by men and done by women, and why we don't see more of the works that were actually considered great by women artists, especially in their own times. And so she was one of the first art historians to really argue actively for the reinterpretation of art in a feminist standpoint and the reintroduction of female artists. So all this to say that I've done my own little Eleanor Hartney-esque investigations of our exhibition planning, and I have dutifully crunched the numbers for us. So since 1995, which felt like a nice round number to me, and with a potentially optimistic idea that 20 plus years after Linda Nochlund's article, May would have possibly made a difference in the state of the museum world in general, it seems that we at the NCMA have shown almost 200 exhibitions of varying sizes. So that includes everything from some tiny projects to some huge ones. So the total number of exhibitions since 1995 that focus solely on one or more female artists is 19. 16 of those were done in the last 10 years. And the only 2 of those 19 exhibitions, only 2 of them were done before I joined the staff at the museum in late 2008, excuse me. So I am saying this not to take responsibility by any means for these shows, but what I am saying is that we as an institution can point to our own interest and work towards very slowly correcting these imbalances. So we have made clearly more of an effort to make women a priority. We are showing more women and showing more women only more frequently. And an important thing to remember is that I am not including mixed gender groups in these tallies of exhibitions and projects that we've done, which will show both women and non-binary artists alongside their male counterpoints. So for giggles, I also did crunch the numbers of male solo exhibitions or group exhibitions that featured only men that we've been showcasing in the last 10 years. And that number, by the way, is 37. So 37 solo or group exhibitions of men only versus 16 for women in just the past 10 years. It's not terrible, but it is a stark reminder to myself as much as anyone else that we are still showcasing women artists, sometimes even less than half as much as we show men. So we can do better, and we are actively trying to do better. And that's why one of my favorite things to do as a curator who specializes especially in modern and contemporary art is to bring various and diverse and disparate voices into the collection. And with initiatives like our Matrons of the Arts programming that was established almost 5 years ago now, that has the opportunity to bring women to the forefront, has made it really integral to our programming. So far I've highlighted a number of works from our collection that present women as artists. And in the case of the Van Muscher also, potentially women who could have actually been real artists or were the creators themselves, like Vijay Lebrun, like Mary Cassatt and Harriet Hosmer. And then of course you've gotten some brief glimpses of Camille Claudel and Bert Morisot and lots of the other contemporary artists that I showed you really quickly. So now in our remaining time together, I'd like to showcase just a few of my favorite works by women in our contemporary collection, all of which have been acquired since 2015, and all of which really address important and incredibly wonderfully profound issues. The first up is my baby, one of my favorite acquisitions. This is a work called Kalia One by the Iraqi artist Hive Karaman. And many of her works discuss these constructions of gender, and especially how they relate to her own lived-in experiences as a refugee and a Middle Eastern woman. She was born in Iraq in 1981, but she and her family fled to Sweden during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. And it was really in Sweden that she grew up and she first started learning to paint. As a young adult, she then moved to Florence, Italy to study graphic design, and she now lives and works at last count, I believe, in Los Angeles. For sure, she's in California now as her long-term home. So her feelings about displacement and really about being a so-called citizen of the world, as well as the many really variety of artistic influences that she admired from her different homes throughout the world, are really best represented in her work, most of which she really resolves through the form of the female body. So for example, many figures in her art are portrayed with these dark, thick, beautiful hair that she has talked about as being directly referenced references to Japanese calligraphy and scroll painting. So when I look at this image, I also like to think of her thick black swoops of ink like calligraphy is representing the hairstyles of these women. So you can kind of see them playing out in the hair. And then the exaggerated long necks and long fingers of these women also reveal her time in Italy, where she was studying Renaissance, especially Mannerist masterpieces, like the Madonna of the Long Neck by Parmigianino. Excuse me. I haven't had to do some Italian stuff in quite a while, which is the work that you see here on the right side, because Mannerism is all about these kind of long, little strange, super exaggerated elements. And then her textile patterns in her paintings show her familiarity with Persian illustrations and Arabic calligraphy, and also Islamic mosaic work, all of which is a very nice nod to her own home and cultural background. So all told, these images become a kind of autobiography. That scratching sound is my cat. One moment. Opening the door. Okay. So it really becomes this little beautiful autobiography about the artist, which is something that I think holds more meaning when you consider that each image or each figure that she shows is actually based on photographs that the artist takes of herself in various poses and costumes that she then later translates into painting. So she calls her body her primary tool. And it also makes sense then that each woman in her paintings has this similar appearance. So they're all kind of fleshy and graceful with these striking, beautiful features and almost kind of translucent glowing skin and this elegance, all with this serene but also kind of distant look on their faces. And they become, like the artist herself, this amalgamation of different influences and regions of the world. And they present a version of the artist and her work that doesn't really neatly fit into one single place or category. And this exploration of identity, I think, is very poignant when you consider this particular quote from the artist when she was speaking about her own background. A few years back, she said, quote, "When I finally went back to Iraq," she was speaking about years after the Gulf War, obviously. She said, "I felt like a tourist. In Sweden, I'm a tourist. And here in the USA, I'm definitely a tourist. The merging of cultures in my art is a search for identity because I have never had a home." So I think that's really beautiful and very sad too. So a final note about the title, which really I think brings this all home, this search for home all together, which is the Kalia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It is a traditional Iraqi dance that originated from nomadic people of the same name, and they're known throughout the Middle East as being people who are very talented in music and dance. I'm showing you a performance here on the screen. So having experienced this actual dance as a child really has been something that was celebrated by the artist as a memory and a way for her to get to the touchstone of her own childhood and really hearkening back to her heritage. So I just love her. There's my cat's tail. Zoom life. This is how it is. Sorry. Meet memers, everyone. So now I am sure that many of you are already really familiar with this next work of art, because I'd even venture to say that it is one of the most popular works of art by visitors of all ages at the NCMA, including my own son, who is here on the screen here when this was taken a couple of years ago when he was about 3 years old. This is our wonderful work, Light of Life by Yayoi Kusama, and we acquired it in 2017. And I think Kusama's life story is another really fascinating one, just like Hive Karaman. She was born in Matsumoto, Japan in 1929, and she really has only had about a year of formal art training when she was studying traditional Japanese painting in the late 1940s. And things really took off for her, though, when she moved to the US in the mid-1950s, and she stayed in New York for about 16 years. So she was there right at the dawn of pop art and minimalism, and it was really the perfect time for her to be there because she became great friends and really close colleagues with people like Andy Warhol, Frank Stella, Joseph Cornell, Donald Judd, just to name a few, all while becoming a really prominent and very interesting avant-garde artist on her own. She first began to get attention in the early 1960s for a series of works that became known as infinity net paintings, or that some people just call dot paintings, where she would literally cover the surface of her canvases, her sculptures, her drawings, and even her clothing and art installations with dots. And the dots have a particular meaning and a purpose behind them, which are all related to the artist's mental health. She started experiencing mental health issues as a child, and they've continued to affect her throughout her life. And often they take a form of hallucinations. And it's something that she's been very direct and forthcoming about, where she talks about this very firmly. She's said, quote, "My art originates from hallucinations that only I can see. I translate the hallucinations and obsessional images that plague me, and all of my works are the products of these obsessional neuroses and are therefore inextricably connected to my disease. I even create pieces when I don't see hallucinations, though," unquote. One of the earliest hallucinations that she experienced when she was a child was that she was envisioning this field of dots that was this world of tiny spots that infiltrated and obliterated every segment of her vision, which I imagine must have been so terrifying. But to her eternal immense credit, instead of becoming incapacitated by her illness, she turned to art as a creative treatment and a solution. And so she translated her works into these visions that were then dot covered items that have covered her works by the thousands or sometimes hundreds of thousands of dots. And so you can imagine that you're dealing with something that's so small, is seen in such a large quantity, that it's not a big stretch to jump to thoughts about the concepts of the infinite, which has been long of interest to Yayoi Kusama. And in the mid-1960s, she began to translate these ideas about the infinite into one of her most famous series, which are these so-called infinity rooms, which are mirror-lined, very kaleidoscopic works of art with these seemingly endless reflections of light that create such an incredible illusion of infinite space that really confound our limits of spatial viewpoint, for example. And there's these colorful lights that blink on and off, usually in a timed manner, that represent, in the words of Kusama, the transience of the world. Now, Light of Life is one of the artist's most recent works. As I mentioned, it was made in 2017 when she was 89. She is currently 92 years old. She just had a birthday 2 days ago. And by all accounts, she is still working, and she has a particular interest in recent years in continually adding on to her Infinity Room series, including these smaller self-contained rooms, which is what we were really happy to acquire. So you can see that our version is this hexagonal box with 3 different openings, or kind of portholes, on every other side, which invites us as viewers to look into this room. And then when you look inside, you see all these small light bulbs that constantly change color in a cycle that's, I think, approximately about 2 to 3 minutes long, which is then multiplied by the mirrors that are on every surface, even top to bottom, all the way around the entirety of the box. So the lights and then our reflections are then repeated to infinite bounds and really challenge our understanding of the world around us. So it's very dazzling, a little disconcerting and disorienting light show, and it's something that you can really get lost in. And it's a way for us to experience this idea of the infinite that can be fun, not necessarily frightening, though I'm sure some people have that experience, but can also be appreciated by museum goers who are young and old. So something for everyone, I think, to appreciate. Next up is one of my favorite pieces by a local artist, and this is a work by Leanne Trong, who is currently a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And she's an artist who often likes to use textiles and in her paintings, and also installation, to investigate different belief systems. And so using the opportunity to talk about their notions of family, of religion, and popular icons. And she often likes to toggle back and forth and play with the idea of the present merging with the past and manipulating these different materials, especially paint and fabric, to adapt to the particular story that she is telling at any given time. And I think here there's also some overlap with some of the stuff that we've been talking about with Hive Karaman, because Leanne Trong is also a foreign-born woman living in the US. She was born in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, and she often talks about straddling these two starkly, in many ways, different worlds. So you can see her really interacting with ideas of things like hybridization and camouflage and cultural ties. And this international lens, of both history and culture has really influenced her work greatly in thinking, especially in relationship to what both paint and textile as materials signify in different areas. So how it might be different from in Vietnam, for example, versus here. And I also have to say, I think I'm thinking about this interest in cultural separation between different cultures and how you might merge the two, and cultural assimilation when I'm thinking about her works, that I think really is just now even more profound and even more important given the events of recent days in Atlanta. Moving on, so Trong has referred to her painting as painted gestures and talks about it a lot in terms of the body as a way to bring her body, her own lived experience, onto canvas, but obviously doing it in a very different way from Hive Karaman, in that she is not representing her literal body here, but is really symbolically figuring herself in her work. And she talks about her body in terms of being marked as a body who is an other for many people in the US. So she's been really concerned that a literal and I think very direct image of her own body and history as an Asian woman or an American woman now of Asian descent might not translate well to an American audience. So again, I wrote this lecture a few weeks back before the recent shooting, so I think it just has even more relevance and resonance now. And she again falls upon all of this through the idea of textile. So reminding us of the clothing we wear, the linens that we have that we wrap ourselves in our own homes, things that remind us of who we are. So our particular work, excuse me, is called I, Buffalo, and it comes from a series that Trong did a few years back called Musings of an Origin. And for this series, she really was looking at the idea of the textile trade, especially dating back to the Silk Road in Asia. And the textiles, it's hard to tell in here, but there's those little silk strips that are hanging down on the painted element. And so it gives you this whirling sense of travel through time and space along the Silk Roads, perhaps, and thinking about the title I, Buffalo, which I think really connotes ideas of the American West, which Trong is really interested in. And then thinking about how when you walk by this work, if you kind of walk at enough of a pace, you actually get this literal fluctuation and this whirling sense from the small movement that the silk that she's included here actually makes. So she's drawing these very interesting and not direct connections between the West and the East as both concepts and also I think as fictions, and allowing us to really kind of tangle and untangle these ideas and the understandings that we might have about Asian culture, about what it means to be an Asian American, someone living in the US today in our diasporic lives, and offering us an alternative way to understand it in a painting that's not very direct. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm really intrigued to see how her work is going to continue developing. She's a very unique and really important artist. And we're lucky very much to have her in our area. Last, but by no means least, thank you for bearing with me. I've gone slightly over and I am respectful of your time, so I'll try to hurry, but I am super excited to highlight this work by American artist Simone Lee, which is one of our newest acquisitions. This work is called Corrugated, and it was brought into the galleries at the end of 2019. So it is possible that if you haven't been to the museum in a while, you may not have seen it in person yet. So Simone Lee was born in Chicago in 1967, and she currently lives in Brooklyn. And even though she was originally trained as a ceramicist, her body of work now contains multitudes, everything from sound and video installations to performances, monumental bronze sculptures you see on the screen here, and then also smaller scale mixed media works, ceramics, and then also bronze sculpture as well. And in her work, she likes to discover and explore different elements of race, gender, and history, but one that is really primarily focused on the female form and on Black female identity. And you'll often see that they're made up of these really fascinating combinations of the human form and kind of vessels of some sort, and even sometimes architectural elements. And across the board, these are almost always depicted as women who don't have eyes. So that they're these female portraits or portrait stand-in that refuse to acknowledge the traditional art historical gaze that is often put upon images of women throughout time. So for Lee, the removal of eyes is also a way of abstracting the figure and maintaining the anonymity of her subjects so that they could really represent anyone. They could represent the every woman. The figure in corrugated sits across this base that can almost be read as like a voluminous skirt or an abstracted body, or maybe even both at the same time. And then that curved corrugated foam of the base or body or skirt, what you want to call it, can also bring us back to thinking about the material itself. So it might make us think about industrial architecture or mechanical equipment of some sort. So things like corrugated metal or corrugated pipe or roofing material. The figure that you see is shown wearing this raffia cape or collar, but what's really interesting is that it isn't a necessary element. The artist actually notes that this piece can be shown either with or without the raffia, and both are acceptable in her own mind, which I think is cool. I couldn't find any images of our particular piece without it, and I don't think we've shown it without it to this point. So I wanted to show you this bronze work, which is from the same time period, that has no raffia element, just so you can have a little bit more of an idea of what that totally bronze piece looks like. And going back to that raffia, though, it has a really interesting link because it is a material that is so frequently used in African art. So it allows us to make this really wonderful contemporary collection to our African galleries as well. So just briefly showing you, on the left is an image of one of our raffia Kuba cloths, and on the right is a masquerade piece from the Brooklyn Museum of Art, not our own collection, but just giving you an idea of the kind of works that Simone Lee is very directly referencing in her works. So very immediately referring to inspiration from the African diaspora, African work in general, but then there's also a connection that can be made to face jugs or face vessels that were really made most often by enslaved people here in the US, which is another nice connection and even perhaps a rebuttal for a southern state like ours, and one that also has such a rich tradition of pottery. The image that I'm showing you here on the screen is from the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum for American History. And I chose these ones in particular because these were noted as having been made here in North Carolina. And one of the first things that I notice about Simone Lee's women are that they immediately grab you. And when you have the opportunity to see her in person, if you haven't yet, you will notice this. They are incredibly commanding and incredibly powerful presences while still being very quiet. They are just, I think, tailor-made for our own contemplation. And they also kind of look like they're contemplating us back, which I think is really intriguing. So they allow us to think about the lives of Black women and also about what it means to be a woman in general, which is something that Simone Lee has spoken about quite a lot in interviews recently, which is this idea that femininity should be understood as a quality that is strong and solid and enduring, and that there is power in quietude as well, and power in silence, just as there's power in being loud and excited, and that women and femininity should not always be seen as the weak things, submissive or fragile or soft, which is what a lot of people typically connote when you talk about femininity. So corrugated here is, I think, this amazing, really solid sentinel that's standing in the middle of our galleries, looking to us and also looking towards the future in some way with these kind of unseeing, invisible eyes. So it's really stirring. And that's why I wanted to end on talking about female artists, especially artists within our collection, with talking about her work today. So I again want to thank you for spending a not insignificant portion of your evening with me tonight, as we have discussed literally thousands of years of women in art and art history, leading us to this current moment at the NCMA. And as I mentioned before, we are truly committed to continuing to share amazing work and amazing stories by women from all over the world, as well as in here in North Carolina. And I am really excited for the opportunity for us all to continue sharing and celebrating these kind of works of art for many, many years to come. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And again, I'm so thankful to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. That was fantastic. It was so insightful. And, I'm just amazed at how concise you were able to make it. So kudos to you.
Over time. Thank you.
But I think you did a fantastic job. So we will have time for maybe 3 questions. I'm sorry. I wish we had time for more, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Yes. And one of the questions that we did get is from Ellen Blair. La Pintura looks like she's gagged or muzzled. Is that because she's a female artist? Which I noticed as well.
That is a great question. Oh my gosh. And I'm kind of shocked that I didn't think to include that. That's a wonderful question. And no, that is I think that's very much our own lens, because I agree with you. I think that's the first thing that I thought of when I first saw that work. But in recalling when I was actually back in the olden days studying Italian art history and learning about Cesare Ripa and the Iconologia, is that painting was seen as being a silent way to communicate. So paintings do not speak. It's not a performing art in any way. So I think that is why typically you see her as being gagged. That's a good question. If there is some kind of misogynistic bent to it, it's not one that has been made clear. But I guess in some ways it's probably, that would not be a surprise. I just haven't come across that in my previous studies on it. Good question. Good question.
And we also have a question from Alia El Bermani. What is the next solo exhibition for a female identifying artist, if you can share that?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. So because we've been in this very weird year, things have changed a lot with exhibitions recently, even so much so that I received a large calendar for the next couple of years yesterday from our chief curator. And then she sent a new one this morning and said, wait, things have changed again. So I confess that I actually am not totally sure. So stay tuned. We have a lot of stuff in the works. It's just, I'm drawing a blank right now, completely blank.
And the last question, which I think was asked by 2 different people, KJ and Alexander and Carol. How large is the Simone Lee piece, if you have the dimensions?
That's a very good question. I did not put the dimensions up on the screen, I don't think. Let me see if I can scroll back very quickly. Man, that would have been helpful. It is large. It takes up a lot of floor space, I suppose you could say. You know what? It is large. It is tall. It's larger than life size when you're standing next to it. It's pretty dominating. I don't have the exact dimensions in front of me. Stay tuned. Come back. Enjoy it in person, hopefully.
I also have a question. I usually don't ask too many questions and kind of try to stay behind the scenes, but I'm really curious. I've lately been doing some research on women artists of my own, and also came across Linda Nochlund's work, and it's fascinating. But what are your thoughts on or your opinion on all women art shows? Do you think they're an effective long-term strategy for achieving gender equity, or do you think they can also be limiting in a sense?
Both. I think both are accurate. And that is definitely a conversation that we have had many times, not only in the museum, but also in grad school and galleries. This is an ongoing conversation. And I don't think that there is a single known way to go about it, because yes, in some ways you can point to these kind of exhibitions as really greatly bringing women artists to the forefront of really representing women more, but then you also see it as marginalizing in some ways, because you're simply in some ways just kind of relegating them to like, oh, now we just have a show of just women, and then you move on to business as usual. Those can both be true at the same time, which makes it very uncomfortable. We are also having these same conversations about representing African art, Asian artists, Black artists. These all kind of go together. I think what's most important is that when we have these thematic exhibitions or opportunities to show multiple artists at the NCMA and elsewhere, that we have the opportunity to show a vast and really diverse group of artists to represent any particular theme. That's not always possible for a variety of different reasons, but I think what's really important is that we all keep trying to be as diverse as possible, and to, if we're going to have solo exhibitions, to have as many solo exhibitions of women as we do of men, or more if we can. We just got to do what we can to bring them more to the forefront across the board.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I really hope you can come and view some of these pieces in person. We are open. We do have safety guidelines in place. So yeah, please come and visit us.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye.